You can smell it before you see it. That warm, nutty sweetness rising off a comal, where a handful of tiny seeds pop like miniature fireworks. Your abuela called them alegrías. The Spanish crown called them something else. They called them a threat. When Hernán Cortés and his men marched into Tenochtitlan, they did not just come for gold. They came for control. And one of the fastest ways to control a people is to take away what they eat. Entire crops were ripped from the soil. Sacred ingredients were banned by royal decree. Foods that had nourished civilizations for thousands of years were declared illegal overnight. Number 6 survived 4 centuries of colonial hatred and came back stronger than ever. And the story behind number 1 might be the greatest food rebellion in the Americas. So hit subscribe, because here are 25 Mexican foods the conquistadors tried to erase forever. Number 25. Chayote. Before the Spanish arrived, chayote grew in every kitchen garden from the Valley of Mexico to the highlands of Guatemala. The Aztecs cultivated it alongside corn and beans in the milpa, eating the fruit, the shoots, the roots, and the starchy seed inside. When the encomienda system took hold, colonial administrators forced indigenous farmers to clear their plots and plant European crops for tribute. Wheat, barley, and Old World squash replaced what had grown there for generations. In the Tlaxcala region, colonial land grants physically converted chayote gardens into hacienda fields. The ordenanzas agrarias required tribute in approved crops, and chayote was never on that list. Farmers who kept growing it risked losing their land allotments entirely. But chayote is a vine that climbs anything vertical. It crept up fences behind houses, along irrigation ditches, over stone walls the haciendas never bothered to inspect. 500 years later, it still shows up in markets from Oaxaca to East Los Angeles, outlasting every man who ever tried to plow it under. Number 24. Guaje seeds. Before the Spanish set foot in the Americas, the guaje tree was a pantry that grew itself. The long, flat green pods hang from the branches like sealed pouches, and inside sit rows of small, round seeds with a sharp, garlicky bite that sits somewhere between raw garlic and roasted peanut. The Nahua people ate them raw, roasted, or ground into salsas. They were so central to daily life that an entire city was named after them. Oaxaca, which became Oaxaca, literally means the place of the Guajes. Colonial administrators saw no commercial value in a tree that grew wild and could not be taxed, so they cleared guaje groves to plant sugarcane and wheat. The trees kept seeding themselves in the hills, and the families who knew their value never stopped harvesting them. Number 23. Jicama. The Aztecs had been eating this crisp, white root vegetable for centuries before a single Spaniard stepped onto the continent. They called it xicamatl, and it showed up everywhere from fruit platters dusted with chile to cooked stews and raw salads sold at every tianguis market. The Spanish did not merely overlook it. When colonial administrators reorganized agriculture across New Spain in the 16th century, they mandated European crops on the best irrigated land. Wheat, barley, citrus, and stone fruits received water rights. Indigenous root vegetables like jicama were pushed to marginal plots and dooryard gardens, where no inspector bothered to walk. The great tianguis markets, where vendors once sold jicamatl by the basket, were dismantled and replaced with regulated colonial plazas that favored imported goods. Church-run haciendas promoted European produce as civilized and classified indigenous crops as peasant food, unfit for proper tables. Jicama survived because it grows in almost any soil with almost no care. Families kept planting it behind their houses, slicing it raw with lime and chile the way their grandmothers always had, passing seeds quietly from one generation to the next, until the rest of the world finally caught up. Number 22. Sapote negro, Cut open a ripe Sapote negro, and the inside looks exactly like chocolate pudding. The flesh is dark, creamy, and naturally sweet, and the Maya and Aztec peoples ate it fresh or blended it with vanilla and orange juice. Spanish friars documenting New World foods barely mentioned it. Their botanical catalogs were obsessed with plants they could ship back to Europe for profit: cacao, vanilla, tobacco. A fruit that rotted within days and could not survive an ocean crossing held no interest for them. Colonial haciendas cleared native fruit trees to plant sugarcane, coffee, and European orchards. Sapote negro survived in backyard gardens and village markets where no colonial overseer cared to look. Too local, too perishable, and too indigenous to matter to the men running the empire. Number 21. Pitahaya. Long before anyone called it dragon fruit, Pitahaya grew wild across the deserts of Baja California and Sonora. The Seri and Cochimi peoples timed their entire year around its harvest, moving camp when the cactus fruited. Spanish Jesuits saw this seasonal migration as the core obstacle to conversion. You cannot baptize a congregation that disappears into the desert every June. So the missions attacked the cycle directly. Jesuit records from Loreto and San Javier document the burning of seasonal rancheria camps to force indigenous groups into permanent mission settlements. Father Johann Jacob Begert wrote that missionaries destroyed temporary shelters near Pitahaya groves to break the harvest pattern. At Mission San Ignacio, priests ordered Pitahaya stands cut back from the perimeter to eliminate the temptation of the old food cycle. The goal was not to erase the fruit itself, but to sever the human connection to it, to make the people forget they had ever followed a cactus across the desert. The Pitahaya did not need people to survive. It kept fruiting on its own schedule, indifferent to every mission bell. Number 20. Xoconostle. Most people know the prickly pear for its sweet red tuna fruit, but the Xoconostle is its sour cousin, a small tart cactus fruit the Aztecs used in sauces, stews, and medicines. Its sharp, almost citrus-like acidity cuts through rich moles and heavy bean dishes like nothing else. The Spanish did more than overlook it. Colonial agricultural policy actively promoted European souring agents. Vinegar imported from Castile, lemon and lime trees planted in monastery orchards across the lowlands. Franciscan friars taught indigenous cooks to adopt these substitutes as markers of civilized cuisine. Cactus foods in general carried a stigma under colonial rule. Administrators classified nopal and its fruits as comida de indios, a label that carried real weight when it came to what could be sold in regulated town markets. Xoconostle was effectively barred from the formal colonial economy, traded only in informal indigenous markets that operated beyond official reach. It endured for the simplest reason. The arid highlands of central Mexico, where Xoconostle grows, could never support a lemon grove. The land itself chose sides. Number 19. Huazontle. This one belongs to the same family as amaranth, and the Spanish treated it with the same suspicion. It is a tall, bushy plant with clusters of tiny green buds that look like miniature broccoli florets. The Aztecs grew it alongside amaranth in the Chinampas, the floating gardens of Tenochtitlan, and used it in tamales, stews, and offerings to the rain god Tlaloc. When the Spanish banned amaranth in the 16th century, Huazontle got caught in the sweep. Both plants belong to the same botanical family, and both were tied to indigenous ceremonies the Catholic Church was determined to stamp out. So anything related to amaranth was suspect by association. But Huazontle had one advantage. It looks nothing like a grain. It looks like a leafy vegetable with feathery green tops, and colonial inspectors walking through indigenous farms often couldn't tell what they were seeing. Families kept growing it in small plots tucked between rows of corn and beans, where it blended in with the other greens. They harvested the tender flower clusters, coated them in beaten egg, and fried them into golden cakes called tortitas de Huazontle, served in a brick-red guajillo chile sauce. The dish became a Lenten tradition across central Mexico, which gave it another layer of protection, since no friar could object to a meatless meal during Holy Week. Today, tortitas de Huazontle are still a Quaresma staple from Puebla to Mexico City. The plant that was supposed to disappear alongside its famous cousin outlasted every decree ever written against it. Number 18. Epazote. The Aztecs and Maya cooked with epazote for thousands of years, dropping its pungent leaves into black beans, quesadillas, and stews. The name comes from Nahuatl, Epazote, meaning skunk sweat. To the Spanish, it smelled like turpentine, and that alone might have been enough to condemn it. But what sealed its fate was its role in indigenous medicine. Epazote was used as a vermifuge, an abortifacient, and a ritual cleanser, and the Holy Office of the Inquisition in New Spain classified indigenous herbalism as potential brujeria. Colonial tribunal records from the 16th and 17th centuries show curanderas prosecuted for dispensing plant remedies, epazote among them. The 1570 Protomedicato regulations restricted who could practice herbal healing and which plants could be sold for medicinal purposes. Indigenous market vendors offering epazote bundles for both cooking and curing found themselves subject to inspection and confiscation. What the inquisitors missed is that epazote is a natural carminative. It breaks down the compounds in beans that cause gas. The cooks who had known this for centuries never stopped putting it in the pot. They just stopped telling anyone why. Number 17. Pinole. Take dried corn kernels, toast them on a comal until they darken and crack, then grind them into a fine powder. That is Pinole. The Raramuri people of the Copper Canyon have fueled their legendary ultramarathons on nothing but a pouch of pinole and a gourd of water for centuries. The colonial government wanted that corn flowing somewhere else entirely. The tribute system under the encomienda required indigenous communities to deliver fixed quotas of maize to Spanish authorities. Corn diverted into pinole was corn that never reached the tribute warehouse. Royal ordenanzas in New Spain mandated that indigenous labor be directed toward milling European wheat, and colonial mills were built specifically to process grain for Spanish markets. In urban centers like Mexico City and Puebla, market regulations restricted the sale of indigenous corn products in favor of wheat bread, which the colonial authorities considered the only civilized staple. Pinole was pushed out of official commerce and back into the mountains where no tax collector bothered to climb. The Raramuri kept grinding it on stone metates in the Copper Canyon, fueling runs that covered distances no wheat-fed soldier ever matched. Number 16. Tequesquite. Before baking powder or baking soda existed, Mexican cooks had Tequesquite, a mineral salt harvested from the dried beds of ancient lakes. The Aztecs used it to leaven bread, tenderize beans, and brighten the color of cooked vegetables. When you see tamales with an impossibly light, fluffy texture in a traditional kitchen, Tequesquite is often the reason. The Spanish did not simply prefer their own leavening. Colonial trade policy subsidized the import of European yeast and promoted it as the civilized way to bake, while the Crown imposed harvesting restrictions on the lake beds where Tequesquite had been freely gathered for centuries. Mineral deposits fell under royal mining ordinances, and indigenous families who had always scraped the white crust from the earth suddenly needed colonial permission to do what their grandmothers had done without a second thought. But in the villages farthest from any magistrate, families kept gathering it when the dry season cracked the lake bed open. It is still sold in markets today, wrapped in paper cones, looking exactly the way it did 500 years ago. Number 15. Tlacoyos. These thick, oval-shaped masa cakes stuffed with beans, requesón, or fava paste were street food before the concept existed. Aztec vendors in the great tianguis of Tlatelolco sold them by the hundreds, and Bernal Díaz del Castillo, who chronicled the conquest alongside Cortés, described that marketplace with undisguised awe. But admiration did not translate into protection. Colonial authorities dismantled the Tianguis network and replaced it with European-style plazas and licensed shops that required permits indigenous vendors could not obtain. Franciscan missionaries went further, banning the open sale of what they called pagan market foods during Catholic feast days, and pushing the women who cooked them to the outskirts. Tlacoyos vanished from every colonial record, eaten only by the people who had always eaten them, sold at dawn on the edges of town in a commerce the crown could not see and could not tax. They are still sold on those same streets today, by vendors whose great-grandmothers did exactly the same thing. Number 14. Tejate. In the markets of Oaxaca, women still serve tejate from wide painted clay gourds called jicaras, scooping out a thick, frothy drink that looks like nothing else on earth. The surface is a pale gray foam flecked with white, almost like a savory cappuccino made entirely by hand, and underneath sits a cool, nutty liquid made from toasted corn, fermented cacao beans, ground mami pit, and a flour called rosita de cacao. The drink predates the Aztec Empire itself. Archaeologists have found cacao residue in Oaxacan vessels dating back more than 2,000 years, making tejate one of the oldest continuous cacao preparations anywhere in the world. The Spanish were obsessed with cacao, but only in the form they could control. They wanted the beans shipped to Europe and processed into sweetened chocolate for aristocrats in Madrid and Seville. Complex indigenous drinks like tejate, which combined mami seeds, maize, and local flours in proportions known only to the women who made them, did not fit that business model. They could not be standardized, could not survive an ocean crossing, and could not be replicated by anyone who had not learned the grinding and frothing technique. Colonial trade funneled nearly all cacao toward export, and the beans indigenous communities had relied on for centuries became harder to get and far more expensive. Tejate survived because the women who made it refused to let it die. They substituted the less prized pataxta bean when the good Criollo cacao was taken for export, and kept the recipe alive from mother to daughter. Every gourd of tejate served in a Oaxacan market today is a quiet act of defiance against an empire that wanted those beans for itself. Number 13. Quelites. The word Quelite comes from Nahuatl Quilitl, and it covers dozens of wild edible greens that grew in and around the milpa: quintonil, verdolaga, romeritos, papaloquelite. Each had its own season, and indigenous cooks knew exactly when to pick each one. The Spanish did not just prefer European vegetables, they actively destroyed the growing conditions that made quelites possible. The hacienda system converted communal milpa land into monoculture wheat and sugar fields, physically eliminating the biodiverse edges where quelites thrived. Colonial agricultural orders classified volunteer plants in tribute fields as maleza, harmful weeds to be cleared on penalty of fines. In the Codex Osuna from 1565, indigenous communities complained to the colonial court that Spanish overseers forced them to uproot plants from their own plots. The repartimiento labor drafts pulled workers away from their milpas during the exact weeks when quelites needed harvesting, leaving entire crops to wilt uncollected. But quelites grow whether anyone tends them or not. They return along irrigation ditches, in the margins of every cleared field, in every crack the monoculture leaves behind. Number 12. Gusanos de maguey. These fat white larvae live inside the leaves of the maguey plant, the same plant that produces pulque and mezcal. The Aztec nobility considered them a delicacy, pan-fried in Chile and rolled into a warm tortilla. The colonial government went after the plant itself. Pulque production was a target of repeated Spanish bans throughout the colonial period. The 1529 Ordenanza prohibited public pulque sales in Mexico City. The 1692 ban following the corn riots shut down pulquerias across the capital. Viceroys ordered maguey fields destroyed near population centers to curb indigenous drunkenness, which they blamed for unrest and low labor productivity. Every time colonial authorities uprooted or burned a maguey field to enforce a pulque restriction, they also destroyed the habitat where Gusanos lived. You cannot harvest larvae from a plant that has been pulled from the ground. The Gusanos were collateral damage in a broader war on maguey culture, but the effect was the same. Their food source was physically eliminated wherever colonial enforcement reached. In the remote valleys of Oaxaca and Hidalgo, beyond the reach of any viceroy's order, farmers kept splitting open maguey leaves and pulling out what was already there. Number 11. Tepache. This mildly fermented drink made from pineapple rinds, piloncillo, and warm spices has been cooling Mexican throats for centuries. The original pre-Columbian version used corn rather than pineapple, but the fermentation technique itself was ancient. The Spanish had a complicated relationship with indigenous alcohol. They wanted to sell European wine and brandy, and any homemade fermented drink was competition. Colonial authorities imposed restrictions on indigenous brewing and periodically raided neighborhoods where large batches were being made. But Tepache requires almost nothing to produce: fruit scraps, sugar, water, and time. A clay pot in a warm corner, covered with a cloth, and in 2 or 3 days you have a fizzy, tangy drink that costs practically nothing. Banning Tepache was like trying to ban fermentation itself. As long as fruit could sit in the presence of sugar and warmth, someone somewhere was going to drink what came out of it. Number 10. Mezcal. The Spanish crown did not just frown on mezcal, they outlawed it. Multiple royal decrees between the 16th and 18th centuries banned the production and sale of mezcal and other agave spirits across New Spain. The reason was straightforward. Spain exported wine, brandy, and aguardiente to its colonies, and locally produced spirits cut directly into those profits. Colonial authorities enforced the ban with fines and confiscation of stills. In some regions, soldiers destroyed agave fields to prevent production entirely. None of it worked. Mezcal production simply moved deeper into the mountains, into the remote barrancas and sierras where colonial officials could not follow. Families built small clay and copper stills hidden among the rocks and kept distilling exactly the way their ancestors had. The word mezcal itself comes from Nahuatl, mexcali, meaning cooked agave, and the technique of roasting agave hearts in underground pit ovens predates European contact by centuries. Today there are hundreds of mezcal producers across Oaxaca, Guerrero, and Durango, many using stills that have been in the same family for generations. Every bottle is a direct descendant of the ones the crown tried to smash. Number 9. Eskimos. The larvae and pupae of a giant black ant, harvested from underground nests in the semi-arid highlands of Hidalgo and Tlaxcala. The Aztec nobility prized them above almost any other food, served on feast days alongside the finest tortillas. The Spanish did not merely find this disgusting. They actively legislated against it. Colonial market ordenanzas in Mexico City regulated which foods could be sold in the tianguis, and insect products were excluded from approved vendor lists by the late 16th century. The 1580 regulations for the Tlatelolco market restricted indigenous sellers to pre-approved categories that did not include larvae, eggs, or any insect-derived food. Vendors caught selling prohibited items faced confiscation and fines. Beyond the market laws, the Inquisition targeted the ceremonial contexts in which escamoles appeared. Feast day foods associated with pre-Christian religious calendars fell under the broad prohibition of idolatrous practices. Eskimos were expensive, seasonal, and invisible underground, which made them nearly impossible to eradicate by decree. Today, restaurants in Mexico City charge more per plate for Eskimos than for a good steak. The Spanish called it barbaric. The ants kept building nests regardless. Number 8. Pozole. No dish in Mexico carries a darker colonial reputation than pozole. The Aztecs prepared it as a ceremonial food with hominy corn and, according to multiple Spanish chroniclers, including Bernardino de Sahagún, with the flesh of sacrificial captives offered to the god Xipe Totec. Whether those accounts were exaggerated to help justify the conquest is debated by historians to this day, but the Spanish reaction was not. They tried to wipe pozole from existence. Colonial authorities in the 16th century issued specific decrees against its preparation, and friars classified it alongside every ritual they considered demonic. In some jurisdictions, preparing pozole was treated as evidence of backsliding into paganism, punishable under the same statutes that criminalized indigenous worship. What happened next is one of the great acts of survival cooking in the Americas. Indigenous families replaced the forbidden protein with pork, the one meat the Spanish had brought in abundance and could never object to seeing in a pot. The hominy stayed. The dried chilies stayed. The garnishes of shredded cabbage, oregano, and lime stayed. Only the single ingredient that had given the colonizers their legal grounds was swapped out, and suddenly the dish was beyond reproach. By the 18th century, pozole had migrated from suppressed ritual food to celebration staple across western Mexico, especially in Jalisco and Guerrero, where it became the centerpiece of Independence Day feasts and family gatherings. The dish the Conquistadors tried hardest to destroy ended up on the table of nearly every Mexican celebration that followed. Number 7. Chapulines. Toasted grasshoppers seasoned with chili, garlic, and lime were one of the most common protein sources in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. Cheap, abundant, and packed with nutrition. The Spanish moved beyond disgust into active prohibition. Colonial market regulations in Mexico City and Puebla excluded insect foods from the official tianguis categories. The 1550s ordenanzas for the central market system designated approved food vendors by product type: meat, grain, fruit, vegetables. Insects appeared on none of these lists, effectively banning their commercial sale in regulated spaces. Spanish authorities physically demolished sections of indigenous markets that sold unapproved goods, as documented in the Relaciones Geográficas of the 1570s and 1580s. In Oaxaca, Dominican friars forced indigenous converts to publicly renounce insect eating during confession as proof of civilized conversion. The Doctrina Christiana texts used in indigenous parishes listed eating unclean creatures among the sins requiring penance, but chapulines swarmed the cornfields in predictable seasonal waves. All anyone needed was a net and a comal. No market, no vendor stall, no transaction any inspector could catch. Trying to regulate a food that literally falls from the sky was a losing battle from the start. Number 6. Huitlacoche. To a European farmer, corn smut is a disease, a grotesque fungal infection that swells the kernels of an ear of corn into bloated gray-black masses. You rip it off and burn it. To the Aztecs, it was a gift. Huitlacoche transforms ordinary corn into something altogether different. A smoky, earthy, almost truffle-like delicacy that tastes nothing like the grain it grew on. The Nahuatl name loosely translates to sleeping excrement, which hardly sounds appetizing, but the flavor has been compared to a cross between wild mushroom and black truffle. Spanish agricultural authorities treated Huitlacoche as a crop disease and ordered infected ears destroyed. For centuries, the United States Department of Agriculture followed the same logic, classifying it as a pathogen and spending resources trying to eradicate it from American cornfields. Meanwhile, in Mexico, families watched their milpas for the first signs of those swollen, silvery kernels, harvested them carefully by hand, and cooked them into quesadillas, soups, and creamy sauces. The ingredient the colonizers and their successors tried hardest to destroy. turned out to be more prized than the corn it grew on. Number 5. Chayote. The bright red seeds of the anato tree colored and flavored Mexican food for over 3,000 years. The Maya ground chayote into paste for seasoning meat, dyeing cloth, and painting the body for sacred ceremonies. That sacred connection is what brought the colonial hammer down. Spanish friars in the Yucatan did not simply ban body painting and move on. They confiscated chayote stores from indigenous households, burned stockpiles found near temple sites, and issued ecclesiastical orders prohibiting the cultivation of anato near mission compounds. The 1562 auto da fe at Mani, where Bishop Diego de Landa destroyed thousands of Maya artifacts and texts, included the seizure of ritual materials stained with chayote. Colonial authorities in Mérida regulated anato production and attempted to redirect it exclusively toward textile dyeing for export, removing it from indigenous hands. In communities under direct mission control, any use of chayote that could not be proven purely culinary was treated as evidence of backsliding into idolatry. But chayote trees grow in every backyard across the Yucatan lowlands. Cochinita pibil, pit-roasted pork wrapped in banana leaves, gets its deep rust, color entirely from the same seeds the friars tried to seize. The kitchens never stopped grinding them. Number 4. Xoconostle. The original chocolate drink of the Aztec world was bitter, spicy, and served at room temperature. Ground cacao whipped with water, chili peppers, vanilla, and sometimes chayote, frothed by pouring it between vessels until thick foam crowned the surface. Montezuma reportedly drank dozens of cups a day, and cacao beans served as currency across Mesoamerica. The Spanish did not simply modify this drink, they dismantled the entire ritual system built around it. Colonial authorities banned the ceremonial Xoconostle service that accompanied Aztec religious festivals, and the Council of the Indies classified the original preparation as linked to idolatrous practice. The cacao trade itself was seized and reorganized under the encomienda, redirecting production toward European markets that demanded sweetened, heated versions. The original bitter recipe, the xocolotl the Aztecs actually drank, was deliberately suppressed as too indigenous, too pagan, too tied to the old religion. What Europe received was a colonial reinvention, while the version with chili and foam and room temperature bitterness was left to disappear along with the temples where it had been sacred. Number 3. Pulque. This thick, milky, slightly sour fermented drink made from the sap of the maguey plant was sacred to the Aztecs. They associated it with the goddess Mayahuel and regulated its consumption strictly. Only elders, warriors returning from battle, and priests performing rituals were allowed to drink freely. Public drunkenness was punishable by death. The Spanish arrived and flipped everything. They dismantled the Aztec social controls on pulque, then panicked when communities started drinking without the old rules in place. Colonial authorities imposed their own restrictions, not to honor the tradition, but to protect the market for European wine and brandy. They taxed pulque production, capped the number of pulquerias allowed to operate, and periodically shut them down entirely. Religious authorities condemned pulque as a pagan drink tied to idolatry. But pulque requires no distillation, no equipment, and no imported ingredients. A single maguey plant produces sweet sap called aguamiel for months on end. Families kept their own plants and fermented pulque at home, far from any colonial tax collector. 300 years of restrictions could not kill a drink that grows in the backyard. Number 2. Chia. Today, chia seeds sit in smoothie bowls and health food stores around the world, marketed as a modern superfood. 500 years ago, the Spanish crown wanted them gone. Chia was the third most important crop in the Aztec economy, behind only corn and beans, and ahead of amaranth. Warriors carried pouches of chia on long campaigns because a single handful mixed with water could sustain a soldier for hours. The seeds were also pressed into oil for ceremonial body paint and mixed into dough for ritual figurines offered to the gods. When the Spanish saw chia turning up in the same religious ceremonies they were trying to abolish, they banned its cultivation alongside amaranth. Fields were burned. Seed stores were confiscated. Planting chia became an act of open defiance. The crop retreated to remote mountain villages in southern Mexico and Guatemala, kept alive for 4 centuries by farming families who simply refused to stop putting seeds in the ground. Number 1. Amaranth. No food on this list was hunted more aggressively than amaranth. The Spanish did not discourage it or neglect it. They declared a formal ban. Anyone caught growing, selling, or possessing amaranth faced imprisonment, or worse. The reason shook the colonial mind to its core. Every year during the festival of Panquistadors, the Aztecs mixed amaranth flour with honey and human blood to form figures of the war god Huitzilopochtli, paraded them through Tenochtitlan, broke them apart, and ate the pieces. The Spanish friars saw a demonic mockery of the Eucharist. The ban was absolute. Amaranth fields were burned across central Mexico. Farmers who hid seeds risked brutal punishment. For nearly 300 years, amaranth all but vanished from public life. But seeds are patient things. Indigenous farmers tucked them into clay pots, buried them near their homes, and kept planting in hidden plots deep in the mountains. Today, amaranth is grown commercially across Mexico, and alegrias, those sweet puffed amaranth bars held together with honey, are sold on nearly every street corner. The conquistadors erased an empire. They could not erase a seed. Those are 25 foods that survived everything an empire could throw at them. Burned fields, royal decrees, 3 centuries of being called primitive or disgusting or dangerous. And here they are, still on the table, still feeding families from Oaxaca to East Los Angeles to the Rio Grande Valley. If your abuela cooked with any of these, or if you still make them yourself, tell us which one in the comments. This list probably missed a few. If this brought back a memory or taught you something new, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have not already, subscribe, because there is plenty more where this came from.